Hey folks, welcome back to the channel, your home for all content Lord of the Rings home. Today we're going to do another installment in the Worth the Whale series on Tibeb and Bekelu. If you're new to the channel, basically this Worth the Whale series, how we're going to do it moving forward is I'm going to tell you if I spent money on a character, and then we're going to discuss whether you should farm them or not. So I'm going to release these videos as characters go from the premium like currency in the main store to farmable, and then we'll talk about whether I think they were worth either spending money on or whether it's worth to farm them up at all. So here in my Haradrim here at Tibeb and Bekelu, I did the marquee packs for both of them, and then it took 7 for Tibeb the Sage, 7 of those like 1,000 gem chests, and 9 for Bekelu. So it evens out to about $100 per each of them. They have been added to the game to be farmable. Bekelu is on Chapter 4. In the guild campaign, the first guild campaign, Chapter 4 character right here, I've been farming her there. And then Tibeb has been added to the challenge store here. 1,500 tokens for 2 or 3,000 tokens for 5. It is different than Bolg and Halbarad. Now, people are pretty upset about this, and I think rightly so. But let me kind of go through and explain why, because I think it's important to visualize all this stuff out. Basically, if you look at how much challenge currency you're going to get per week, if I'm just going to consider the max difficulty here, 600 challenge tokens, you get 3 of those per day that you have this active. So you have 3 days that they're active. So you basically end up with 5,400 challenge tokens a week. If we go back to the challenge store and look here, right, it's 2,500 for 5 Bolg or Halbarad shards, and then it's 1,000 for 2 shards here, right? So it's still 500 coins, challenge coins per shard for Bolg or Halbarad. Like I mentioned earlier, it's 1,500 for 2 or 3,000 for 5. So it's actually more expensive to buy 2 shards for Tibeb compared to the 5 shards for Tibeb, and she's just more expensive overall than both Bolg and Halbarad. So yes, the pricing is both higher and not like equivalent between the 2 and 5 shards, but it's actually the fact that she's in the challenge store at all that is the big deal. So let's go through that. Okay, we're getting back to our roots. We got a spreadsheet here. This is a swag classic. So what I have here is basically that based on how many challenge tokens you're getting per week, you can get about 10 shards of Bolg or Halbachad, but it's about 7 shards a week for Tibeb. That means you're getting basically 81 weeks to take Bolg or Halbarad from 0, like scratch, 0 shards, up to a complete 7 star. So those 810 shards, right? It takes about 115 weeks, 116 weeks to be able to do that for Tibeb. So even just that price difference is massive in increasing the amount of time it takes to get to Tibeb. Thinking about it in weeks is, I don't know, I don't like that. I like it to think about it in days. It's about 567 days for Bolg and Halbarad, 810 days for Tibeb, right? Over 2 years to get her to full 7 stars from scratch. And this is actually basically the math that my podcast host, TormDK, laid out in the suggestions and feedback post that he did talking about this. Basically talking, we just don't get enough currency and the cost is too high to make this viable. When you have a character that takes over 2 years to acquire 7 stars from scratch, that's insane. And that's why people are so upset. And I think that's a very apt comparison. Torm here compares this, the number of days to how many days we've had since launch. He also compares it to some of like the other ways to farm characters, either hard node farming or he's got arena characters here at 7 stars, 162 days to get to 7 stars there. So if we switch back over, let me just do arena store, 162 days, right? We can actually compare how long it takes to get Bolg and Halbarad and Tibeb compared to basically all of the other game modes, right? So very fast in Guild Campaign 1 and 2, it's about 31 days. 3 to 5 is 38 days, so about 38 days for you to be able to completely max Bekelu if you were farming her from scratch, right? That's a very short amount of time, right? A little bit more than a month. Hard shard takes 214 days. That's when you do 0 refreshes. Bolgan Halberad right now in the challenge store still takes over a year, 567 days. We just talked 810 days from Tibeb, 162 days from the arena store. So a fellow store thing. So Torm compares it to how many days since launch. I actually think it's better to compare based on the other game modes we have here, right? Let's do it this way, actually. So we know 810 days, and we'll do this, and we'll drag that down, right? So this is, when you look at it like this, I think this just really illustrates how insane this is, because even compared to just Bolgan Halberad, it takes 1.4, almost 1.5 times as long to get Tibeb. If you compare it to the other sort of longest farm in the game, right, the hard node shard farming, where you don't do any refreshes, it's still 3.8 times longer than that. Not to mention the fact that, like, with hard node farming, you can do refreshes. You can't do that with the challenge store because you can't refresh it. You're limited by currency, basically, not by how many times you refresh or energy or whatnot. So this is why people are rightfully upset. I think it's pretty crazy. It's even, 5 times longer than the arena store. So that's the bad news. Here's some good news. Here's an update that CG Heem posted yesterday about this situation. Let me just read it really quick. Small end of the day roundup. I've had a couple of conversations with people about the 2 biggest points to come out of today. Challenge store, Tibeb, and Hobbit bundles. We're gonna focus just on the challenge store right now. Challenge store Tibeb. While the initial issue that people have is specifically Tibeb in this update, I'll get to that in a second. The bigger, more difficult, and arguably more fundamental problem to solve is to improve the challenge store. It's far from a perfect implementation and not a perfect design either. The team hear your feedback and want to improve the challenge supplies and make it a better experience using that particular store and gaining challenge currency. As such, we're exploring a number of different possibilities. No timeline is available yet. When it comes to Tibeb and her challenge currency cost, that feedback has been heard and will be reviewed again about how those values were decided on. The takeaway on this area is the challenge store is going to get renewed attention and will be reprioritized with the current work, so as more time and attention. Stay tuned. So this is a very positive message to me, because the day that this update went live, people basically voiced their feedback and concern on Discord, and then the same day they heard that feedback, discussed that feedback, and now have what appears to be some sort of actionable plan to readdress this moving forward. Obviously, I plan on keeping an eye on this and making sure that they do follow through with this, but I'm cautiously optimistic. I really did like the changes that they came up with Chapter 1, and I thought those came relatively quickly. They came out a lot sooner than I was expecting, that's for sure. And I liked the changes that they had. So I'm cautiously optimistic until kind of proven otherwise. I think they've handled some stuff in the past reasonably well, most specifically the Chapter 1 rework. So that's the good news part of it. So people were mad. They started to address that. We'll see what they do. I think there's a number of possibilities here. You can either essentially raise the amount of currency you get every week, right? From, let's just say, the challenge store challenges. Or 2, you can decrease the cost of how much the shards are in the store itself. You could also probably just like revamp the whole system and store and challenges and whatnot, but that's too complicated. I'm not exactly sure how they would go about that. So I'm just going to stick to the first 2 here. And then of course they could do some sort of like combination of the 2. I think these are the simpler of the 2 options, and they obviously got to make sure that they aren't going to like cause some sort of rippling effect through the game economy. So I actually don't think it's as simple as just like going into the game file and like changing a few numbers. I do think they have to sit down and actually think about it, and I prefer that they do that and get it right the first time, as opposed to just doing a quick fix and then having to re-change it again later, or giving somebody a massive advantage or put somebody else at a massive disadvantage because, they didn't go through this sort of checks that they need to do before they kind of just change things very quickly. Here's what I would like to see. I would like to see all of the challenge store characters now and future have the same pricing, and I would like the farm time to be about 300 days. So that puts you at about 75 days more than a hard node farm where you're doing no refreshes. So it still maintains a challenge, I guess, right? I'm sure the challenge store farm can be challenging, but putting it at about 300 days and then either increasing the currency we get or decreasing the cost of the shards. So I actually have a little bit of what that would look like here. So 300 days here, right? Again, just to go from scratch to a full 7 stars, that'd be about 43 weeks. And that means we would need to be getting about 19 shards a week. So if they were to just increase the amount of currency we got, we're looking at about 9,500 challenge coins a week. That would kind of be what we would need to kind of go for what I would like to see and where I would like it to be placed in terms of farm time. Or if they went the decreased cost route, they would need to decrease the cost per 1 shard to be about 285 challenge coins. That means that the 2 shard cost is about 570 and the 5 shard cost is about 1425. Either of these, I think, would accomplish what I'm looking to see. And you have to also remember that, most people have either Tibeb and Tibeb at like 3 stars from the marquee, or maybe they did, like me, buy the marquee pack or some of the chests and whatnot. So they have it a little bit higher. So it's not exactly going to take 300 days still. There's you have a little bit of a head start there. But this is what I would like to see in general, so that when, newer players come into the game, they're thinking about Haradrim, whether they should get them. They can take this into consideration. Okay, it's going to be a long farm. It's going to be longer to get Tibeb than, Robil or Yeftu, who are on the hard nodes, right? Okay, so let me actually answer the question if Tibeb is worth the whale. Is it worth getting her from the challenge store? And the answer is basically no, unless your roster fits a very certain criteria. And I think the only case in which you should probably still buy Tibeb is if you have pretty maxed or geared out Haradrim in terms of like abilities and just gear levels and whatnot. You don't necessarily have the star levels on Bekelu or Tibeb, and you don't care about Bolg or Halbarad. I think that is the only situation I would feel comfortable being like, yeah, you should probably just continue farming Tibeb from the challenge store. Also, if you are in that situation, don't hoard your currency. I think that's only going to help you if they decrease the cost of the shards itself. And we don't know what they're going to do, so you just probably just keep chucking your challenge coins at Tibeb. I do think if you basically have any other roster, it's not worth it. Either focus on Bolg or Halbarad because he costs less, or they cost less, or, I don't know, just do one of the other characters, right? I still think you should be using your challenge coins, by the way, to farm character shards. Character shards are king, that is my mantra, it seems like. I think that's still the way to go, but Tibeb, not worth it unless it's a very specific situation there. What's interesting, though, about that is, like, let's say you have like a level 45 gear tier 6 Haradrim team kind of across the board here. You're maybe at 3 stars to a little bit higher depending on the character. I think you probably got to put them on the back burner for a little while. So there's this kind of argument that, well, Tibeb, all you really need is her leadership ability, right? You don't actually care if she survives that much because the leadership ability persists through death, and her passive is just not like contributing that much to the rest of the team comparatively. But she's the team's healer, and if she has much lower stars relative to the other team, like characters on the team, then she's basically useless at that point. Two-turn haste is still pretty good. Her leadership ability is obviously still very good, but I am very much in the camp where, like, it's not worth, getting Haradrim, putting more resources into Haradrim until you have the ability to get stars on Haradrim, because they are so dependent on inflicting banes, and they need the focus from having stars to be able to do that. So you can still keep farming them if you want, just to have them at 5 stars, just in case, there's a legendary that comes out that requires them. But if that's the case, you might be hosed anyway because of the challenge store. I don't think it's really worth it. But let's talk about Bekelu. So she is on Guild Node Chapter 4. And I think the short answer to should you be farming Bekelu, is she worth the whale? And farm is yes. The gold, XP, and ability materials are very good. Right? It's the second best chapter right after chapter 5, obviously. So I think it's probably still worth getting shards of Bekelu. Whether you decide to put resources into her is a completely different sort of question that I'll talk about right now. I think if you are a free-to-play or a light spender, it's probably not worth putting resources into Bekelu. Those resources are better spent on other teams like Elves and Rohan and Isengard. And until you maybe are going to have the whole Haradrim team farmed up, it's probably not worth including her in there. If you are a moderate to big spender, I do think she's probably worth, putting more resources into. So I think everybody should be farming her, but putting resources into her, I think you should if you can afford to, basically, on your roster. And the reason for that is because I actually think she has quite a bit of plug-and-play utility in the raids. In particular, I use her with an Isengard squad in chapters 1 and chapter 3. I'm probably going to try her out in chapter 4. So I typically use her in chapter 1 instead of Ajak here. And chapter 3 I do instead of Ajak as well. I might do chapter... I don't know what I'm going to do for chapter 4 yet. I think this might be the old chapter 1, and I have footage from that. But basically what I'm showing you here is the strat that I typically use, which is I use Ugluk's Blind on the Skull Crusher, and then I use Bekelu's Basic to stick poison. And normally Ugluk's Blind doesn't stick because the Shadow Seer goes next before the Skull Crusher, and then clears the blind off with their Basic, and then the Skull Crusher hits you and slows everybody down. So instead, you apply 2 buffs. Shadow Seer can only cleanse 1. You hope it is the poison like there, right? And then boom. So I think she's got a good number of... Yeah, this is the old one. I'm just going to let it play out, though. So I think she has a good number of uses there. She's also a cleanser, and they just don't have that on the Isengard team. So that's why I use them there, just to make my Isengard team more viable. She can also apply Black Serpent's Poison with just one of her skills, so I find that she's actually very useful in controlling, a stray War Guard, perhaps. How she's going to do in Chapter 4, I'm not so certain. But she does have some plug-and-play viability, and as we know, cleansers are basically a top priority in the raid, right? So she can kind of help contribute to that. She also can apply concentration with her cleanse. There's that sort of thing. Definitely farm her. Only put resources into her if you can afford it. Otherwise, there are much better options at the moment for dumping your resources into, probably teams that you already have farmed up. That is it from me. Thanks for watching. Take it easy.